Hello, my name is Anna Rajat, and I am the owner and producer of Magistry Studios, and today I thought I'd do an introduction into story gaming. Before we get into story gaming, let's talk a little bit about trad gaming, or traditional gaming, popularized by systems like D&D and Pathfinder. So, trad gaming has a history in wargaming, which is where you use miniatures to create a battle map across a grid screen, where the focus is combat, so all of the mechanics are based on range of weapon, ability to move, if there's spells, how those spells angle or take aim, anything like that. And because of the history of wargaming, a lot of trad gaming is also focused on battle or fighting centric systems. For example, in D&D, you typically wouldn't be playing that game if at some point it didn't break down into a combat encounter. Otherwise, you'd feel like you were missing out because so many of the rules are centered around these really cool fights. The character sheets for trad gaming tend to be on the longer side, where if you're creating it for the first time, it's not uncommon to take 4 hours to create one character, though it gets a lot faster as you get more familiar with the system, where some people who are really good will only take 30 minutes to an hour to complete a character. Because these characters tend to be on the longer side, it's very common to see things like Session Zero, where people will come together as the party and make sure that all of the characters are well balanced together, supporting each other, developed in story and backstory, and everything necessary to jump really hard and fast into the game in Session 1. The major role of the player is to play their character, which sounds a little simple, but it will become clearer why we're making this clear right now when we start talking about story gaming. In trad gaming, by playing your character to the fullest and truest form of that character, considering your responsibility of that narrative part of the story, you end up creating a balance within everybody else of who has responsibility over what part of the story. So that gets us into the GM, who constructs most of the story. When we talk about these type of games, trad games typically have what we call symmetrical rules, which is where the main function of the mechanics are the same for the GM and for the players. So remember, as we were saying, it takes about 30 minutes to an hour for someone good to complete a character. The GM is doing that for every single NPC, every combat encounter, creating every dungeon architecture, going through and creating narrative storylines and branching pathways, all of that type of stuff. It's a lot of responsibility, and a lot of the power of the game, being good or bad, ends up falling on that GM. So as a result, this GM is usually considered a high responsibility or authority figure for this game. Now getting into story gaming. One of the jokes about story gaming is that it is sad things on index cards. Index cards are used a lot in story gaming to map out the story that you are crafting together, to make a visual representation of it on the table. And sad things tend to be more interesting than happy things and create more dynamic stories. So sad things on index cards. The character sheets for a lot of these story games tends to be a lot more streamlined, designed for pickup play. So where you would take an hour to 4 hours to create a character from the ground up in a trad game, in story gaming, it's pretty common that you pick out your character sheet, and within 15 minutes you have something that is playable and you're jumping straight into the game. From there, you also tend to skip Session 0 because you tend to be jumping straight into Session 1. This is one of the reasons why a lot of these story games are popular in convention situations, where people are meeting people for the first time and they just want to play the game, even when they're playing their own character. So in 4 hours, you could get everywhere from the assignment of the table to the mapping out of the characters and finishing the character sheet along with the rest of the story to make you feel like you've had a cohesive conclusion within those 4-hour time slot. So, pretty cool in my opinion. One of the other things that happens is because of how these character sheets are designed, the players are equally responsible for the control of the narrative story as well as just playing that character. What does that mean? In story gaming, a lot of the decisions and a lot of the conflicts that come off are much more narrative. So as a result, people are interested in what moves you pick and what decisions you might make for your character in order to navigate the entire story. For example, if you choose the move from Dungeon World, break gates, bend bars, it means that you probably want to break down a gate. So as a result, the GM is then told, by you picking that move, give you a gate to break down. From there, we also have asymmetric rules for the GM and the players, which is to say the GM is using with a different rule set than the rest of the players, designed to streamline all of the mechanics that the GM does and create a little bit more equal of a playing field for the actual amount of work that happens for the GM and for the players. So the hierarchy ends up becoming a little bit looser and not quite as strict. It's honestly a little bit closer to a moderator role than an authority role. And from there, it's also very common to see people throw major plot points to the characters to see if any of the players have more interesting ideas than the GM as things are going. Some games have such extreme rules like Monster Hearts, where they say, don't plan anything in advance, keep the game feral. So as a result, there's a lot of room for open opportunity for everybody. At this point, I want to clarify the term indie gaming because story games are indie games, but not all indie games are story games. What does this mean? Independent studios create a bunch of games in America and across the entire world. Story games are usually inherently indie games because they're smaller press coming out of small publishing houses, but not all indie games are going to be story games. There are quite a few trad games coming out of these small publishing houses as well that end up getting labeled as story games when they're not. They're trad games. And I've worked with quite a few producers and writers within the indie gaming spectrum who said we deserve a seat at the table as well. So keep that in mind. Indie gaming is a legal and financial term. It is not to be used just whenever you want to say instead story gaming. Okay, so let's get into the history of how story gaming got put on the map as it is today. The game that pretty much opened up the opportunity for most story gaming to be seen today was Bully Pulpit Games and Fiasco, which is a scene-focused game, GM-less, where you create a couple of index cards social mapping of items or connections between up to 4 characters, and then from there you play through progressively more disastrous scenes until you reach the conclusion where sometimes good things happen, but probably some pretty bad things are going to happen to your character, and it's definitely going to be a funny time. From there, you ended up having Meg and Vincent Baker create the system of Apocalypse World, which is to this day probably the most hacked story game system out there. Apocalypse World was designed in order to play games like Mad Max, anything where you have the Great Apocalypse, where each character has the ability to add things into the world. So the Heart Holder will add a civilization that they're trying to put together into the game, or the Skinner is someone who is putting beauty into the world that doesn't really exist often, either through tattooing or dancing, possibly singing, remains to be seen. And it became a system that really focused well on the interactive nature of the players, where the relationships between all of the characters is the focus of the game. Other systems that you might have heard of include Monster Hearts, which was popularized by Critical Role. You have Avatar: The Last Airbender by Magpie Games, which is one of the most successful Kickstarters that has ever happened. And then there are some smaller games like Monster of the Week, where you play a Buffy-like game, or possibly The Witcher. You also have Dungeon World and 10,000 Arrows, where you are diving into a D&D light game, or historical feudal Japan with some mythological twists. It's quite an interesting system. Then we have other systems that became popular on the map, such as Fate and Fate Accelerated, where you were playing games of grand, high-powerful hijinks using these attributes of the characters to affect dice rolls rather than stats. For example, I am the most powerful warrior in all of the land, ends up being both a positive and a negative, where I'm the most powerful warrior, so I can probably win this fight easily, so I get an extra die to my roll. However, I'm also the most powerful warrior in the land, so other people are probably trying to fight me. And so you might get a sneak attack at any given time to prove that you are not as powerful as you say you are. One of the games that I like the most within the system is called Bulldogs, and I highly recommend checking it out because it is a very silly game. Fate is a very, very silly system. You also ended up having the Gumshoe system, which introduced in Mystery this idea of, what if not finding items was at the core of the game, like in Call of Cthulhu, where you roll a D100 to see if you win information or if you miss a clue. Gumshoe said, finding the clues is easy, putting together the information is the hard part. So let's focus on that. And so there's quite a few games within the Gumshoe system. My favorite is Trail of Cthulhu, which is one of the things that we're going to be getting into a little bit later. Finally, the last major system outlines that I'm going to be covering is Belonging Outside Belonging, popularized by Dream Askew with Avery Alder, which is a token system where you're using tokens to narrate what is happening to the general world around you, if you are doing something grand and fantastic, or if you are taking a hit in order to try to pile up tokens for more beneficial things later on. It is a completely GM-less system, and it has been becoming more and more popular among story gamers to iterate, hack, and develop the system. One of the other things that I want to go into is the introduction of cosmic horror and how a couple of things have changed, especially in the changes of how insanity mechanics happen. So as I said before, Trail of Cthulhu works with the Gumshoe system. One of the interesting changes it changed in this idea of sanity mechanics is, instead of just going down a straight tracker of I saw a blue fish and now I'm sad forever, you don't go insane immediately like that in real life. And so some of these story games have iterated on different mechanics in order to provide more opportunities for insanity presentation. So in Trail of Cthulhu, you have two sanity stats, sanity and stability. Sanity is how much you have of understanding the world as everybody else understands it. And then stability is how you are dealing with the shock of finding scary things that question your worldview. From there, stability goes down, you might faint, versus sanity goes down and you start seeing things. Two different tracks. One of the other games that I also highly recommend taking a look at, which I'm biased because I helped work on the project, is Fearful Ends, When we were designing the system, we said, what if we took how the brain gets tired as the main way of dealing with insanity? So none of the insanities are based off of DSM diagnoses, but instead things that just happen to the brain when the brain is tired and overtaxed. You might go into fight or flight, you might go into fawn, or you might start seeing things because neurons are firing in ways that you did not think they normally would. And they typically wouldn't. They're just doing it right now. Before we wrap up, I want to make a little bit of a disclaimer of I'm not trying to say that story gaming is better than trad gaming. I'm just trying to get an introduction of story gaming on this channel so that we can dive into some more interesting developments that have happened because of co-evolution that has happened internationally in gaming. I think it's really important to say that trad gaming is still very important today and is the most popular style of gaming, and they just tell different stories. Sometimes you feel like a good combat, sometimes you feel like a negotiation, sometimes you feel like there's just flirting with friends. All of those have different games and different recommendations for what to pick for that night. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I think that's an absolute joy because more games is more games, which means more opportunities to find what really resonates with you as a player and really get out there in the world of what you're looking for in your source of entertainment. I also think it's really important that we do play both because, one, how we run those games is going to be different, and so we're picking up different skills that we can cross-pollinate by running trad games and seeing how that can construct story games, and story games provide a lot of opportunity for flexibility, which in turn makes trad games better. So do both. And also as a player, if you are focused on playing a really, really good character while also looking over your shoulder in order to how to set up other players at the table to have a better time, tell a better story, that's also neat. I think it's also important to talk about how all of these lines of story gaming and trad gaming are really in flux right now because we have a lot of systems that are hacking mechanics that previously did not work, and now we're finding ways of making them work. It's just because nobody's done it before doesn't mean that it can't be done. We have some games like Vampire the Requiem Blood and Smoke, which is a trad gaming based off of the White Wolf system, and it was written by a bunch of people heavily inspired by story gamers in order to make a more accessible, more narrative story game, while still being true to the trad gaming elements. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that develop in the next few years. In the meantime, we're going to be jumping into a couple more topics about how story gaming has ended up influencing the rest of the world in kind of interesting academic ways, and follow along to see us get into that. In the meantime, give this a hype, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.